Hello everyone, this is Mr. Allen. I'm here to give you an introduction to the parts of speech through a consideration of the parts of a sentence. Okay, so we'll look at a few sentences, we'll break them down into their primary parts, and from that we'll develop an understanding of the most basic parts of speech. Let's start with a couple of sentences. The President of the United States quickly gave his cabinet emergency orders, and he commanded. Okay, two very different sentences. You can look at the first sentence, which is full of details, and then the second sentence, which is pretty straightforward, not a lot of details there. However, what they do have in common is that they are both complete sentences. Now, every sentence needs two things. Number one is something that will be described, and number two, you may have guessed, is a description of that something. So let's look back at these other sentences. I'd actually like to start with the second sentence and see, can we see something that is being described? Certainly. The word he. Okay, that's who or what will be described. In this case, it's a who. It's something we'll come to know as a pronoun that refers to a person. Okay, do we see a description of he? Tells us what he did or gives us more information about him. Yeah, we have the word commanded, which tells us what he did. Okay, let's look at the first sentence and see if we can identify the same things. Do we see something that is being described? Person, place? Sure we do. We actually have a nice long phrase, the President of the United States. We'll break that down a little bit more in a second. Do we have a description of the President of the United States telling us what he did? Sure we do. He quickly gave his cabinet emergency orders. Pretty straightforward. These are full phrases rather than words, but they function the same way as the words did in the second sentence, he and commanded. They fulfill those same obligations. Something that will be described and a description of that something. Now, we don't want to keep using these long phrases to describe these fundamental parts of a sentence, so let's give them their proper names. Okay, something that will be described, we're going to call our subject. Okay, and our description, we're going to call the predicate. Okay, makes things a little bit easier, make it easier for us to talk about it. And these are the common terms that you'll hear. So in the second sentence, if we look at the words that we outlined, he, the something that will be described as our subject, and the description, commanded, we'll refer to that as the predicate. Same thing with our first sentence. The President of the United States, that's our subject. It's something we'll learn to call the complete subject because it's got our primary subject and some extra pieces of information. And our complete predicate quickly gave his cabinet emergency orders. Right here is our primary predicate, what we'll call our simple predicate, and some extra details. So what do I mean when I say simple subject, simple predicate? Well, I can boil down the President of the United States to one specific word that captures most of the meaning of that phrase, president. And when I look at the description, there's one word that jumps out that's really controlling all the rest of the details, and that's the word gave. Okay, so we break all that down, and you may be asking yourself, or wanting to ask me anyways, Mr. Allen, why do I need to know this? And that's a pretty great question. You're going to need to know this because these are the major building blocks of sentences, and they'll be made up of these other building blocks we'll call the parts of speech, which you need to know to fulfill the SOL requirements of this course, and more importantly, to develop better awareness of your own writing and its strengths and weaknesses. So, do we know the 8 parts of speech? Take a second to yourself. See if you can figure them out. There are 8. Let's start with one of the most basic. Anyone guess a noun? Sure, and right behind it might be pronoun. Follow that up with verbs. You have adjectives, adverbs, prepositions, conjunctions, and interjections. Very few people get all 8 at once. Don't feel too bad if you missed them. What we are going to focus on in this first quarter are just these first 4. And we'll wait till the second quarter to get to the rest of them. Okay? So what do they have to do with subjects and predicates? That's another great question. Anyone your age would be able to tell me the definition of a noun. You might say it is, we'll get these other ones out of the way. You might describe a noun as a person, place, thing, or idea. That's a typical description I'll get. I don't really like the word thing. We can keep it there. Why get rid of it? But I prefer the word object. Why? Well, if you think about it, isn't a person a thing? Isn't a place a thing? But I'm digressing here, and it's not as important as getting the main concept down. Answer this question for me. If we're going to describe the subject as something that will be described by the predicate, what part of speech will the subject be? Hint, hint. It's got to be a noun, right? If nouns represent things, then something that we're going to discuss is going to be a noun, or maybe a whole phrase built around a noun like we saw in our other sentences. So he will come back to, let's look at the President of the United States quickly gave his cabinet emergency orders. President is a noun, and we get a whole phrase when we turn into the President of the United States. Okay, is he a noun? We're getting into difficult waters there, because technically he, while it represents a person, and which would qualify as a noun, he is a more generic word we've substituted for a specific noun, in this case the president. So we'll refer to he as a pronoun. Okay? Pronoun, if we jump back to our definitions page, will be a generic placeholder for a more specific noun. And they get their meaning from the words that have come before them in sentences. So, talking about nouns and pronouns, can they show up, can they show up anywhere other than the subject? Certainly they can. Let's jump back at our more complicated, more detailed sentence. We can have nouns show up as receiving the action of the predicate. So the president gave, what did he give? He gave orders. Okay, this is something we'll learn to call a direct object, and you bet it's a noun. They can also secondarily receive the action of the predicate through the direct object. So the president gave orders. Who received those orders? His cabinet. The cabinet will become our indirect object, and yes, is another noun. They can also be points of reference. So when I mention the president, there are many presidents. Which president? We can use a prepositional phrase of the United States to clarify our meaning. And the United States, is that a place? Yes, it is. Is that a noun? Yes, it is. Okay? What about those verbs we were talking about? Well, verbs are words that describe action, describe a state of being, or otherwise describe their subject, the noun in question, by connecting it to other words that will add to that description. And since they are the keystones of these descriptions, you keep hearing that word description, they begin, you guessed it, predicates. Okay? In our second sentence, commanded, very simple here. Commanded describes an action. Okay? And in our first sentence, we had the word gave. Gave began this whole, first of all, it describes an action, and then it led us down the path that led to all these other details that follow with his cabinet emergency orders. Okay, what about all those other words in our first sentence we haven't discussed, like quickly, the use of his, the word emergency? Well, we'll come back to those. They'll be part of a collection of words we'll learn to call modifiers. That'll take us into adverbs, more into prepositional phrases, other parts of speech that were mentioned before. But we'll get into those once we can easily find, spot, identify our nouns, pronouns, and verbs, and we'll accomplish that more quickly if we use this basic understanding of the parts of the sentence: subjects, direct objects, indirect objects, objects of prepositions, and predicates. That's all for now. I hope you learned a lot.